I think, well, and I know the story quite well, but maybe a lot of others don't. But you ended up having an issue with the oceanic white tips at that time. Could you tell us that story?
Yeah, this was a little over a year after I had stopped doing the Navy diving, and when I went from that, I immediately went into commercial diving, and there was a big project down there at the time. But this also introduced me to some people that with a there was a marine laboratory there. There was a division of I think it was Fairleigh Dickinson University, and I started doing diving work for them. Everything from photography to placement of traps for various things they wanted, things like this. And and then sometimes I would also supervise the scientists that needed, supervision. But on this particular day, we this was October 14th, 1972. Hard to believe that's going to be 48 years this fall. But there were three of us going out to recover um, some things from a fish trap that we had set down a week before. And then there were some other sampling devices that we had to recover as well. And these were all at about 220 feet, something like that. And everything was going fine. Were on our during our initial descent. We were coming right down on the areas that we had to work in, and we noticed two oceanic white-tip sharks, big ones. They were about 12 to 14 feet. They were pretty good size. You don't see them like that anymore. And what surprised us, we weren't scared of the sharks. It surprised us to see them that close to shore because we had actually swum out from the shoreline because it was only 100 yards out to the drop off, and that's where we were working. And so we kind of noticed the sharks, and I took a couple of pictures of them. We continued down to depth, and when we reached the turn point for air pressure to come back up and start doing our decompression, the two other guys, one guy's name was Rod Temple, the other guy's name was Robbie McIlvaine, and McIlvaine was running a little bit lower on air than me, and so I told him to begin his ascent and just wrote on a slate. I just said ascend to 160 or something like that to get him up into a safer zone. And then I was going to wait around for Rob, and I moved up about I don't know 30 or 40 feet. And when I looked back down to see what was holding him up, there was all this uh, silt and disturbance on the bottom and the sand and everything. And I know what was going on. I thought that he had basically had a hose failure, and it was this hose was wanging around and was causing the disturbance on the bottom. So I swam back down thinking he might need to buddy breathe or something like that. And I swam into the cloud of silt and sand and bumped into him and almost immediately realized that something else was wrong. And then when things cleared, I grabbed him and just started to drag him up a little bit. And when I came out of the limited visibility section that had been stirred up, that's when I saw that there was a one shark. I only saw one initially, had bitten him on the leg, and so I reached over and it thumped it on the gills, and it kind of backed away, and I was trying to get Rob up, and then the second shark came in and hit him again. Now at this point, they one of the sharks grabbed him around his thigh level and started dragging him and me hanging on to him over the drop off. And I could, we were right on the edge of a near vertical drop off, and we got pulled over the edge. And as we were going down, I'm battling, trying to pull him up, and also trying to fend off the sharks at the same time. And I'm not having much luck with it. Now you got to remember, we started our dive at 220 feet. We'd already done a 15, 18-minute exposure for our working bottom time, and then this whole thing comes off. And now we had more than enough gas for the dive. We were wearing doubles, but the as we got dragged down, obviously our air consumption went up tremendously. And I remember at one point, you know, wasn't quite sure how deep we were, but this is back in the era, of course, of analog depth gauges and stuff like that. And they had not invented, well, they had the, the, the only depth gauge that we had access to in that era was a screw probe gauge that went to 325. And when I got a chance to finally look at my depth gauge, it was pegged. It
Right.
was pegged 320. So we were deeper than 325. Um, at one point, the attack stopped briefly, and I dragged Rod over into a sandbank on the edge of the wall and was trying to get him stabilized. And it was very. You didn't have time to think about a lot of this stuff. You were acting on instinct, and but when we were away from the sharks briefly, and it only lasted about 30 seconds, I could see that most of his left leg had been essentially ripped off,
Wow.
and he had been also pretty badly bitten in the abdomen, and his belly was, there were holes in his chest and stuff like this. And that just freaked me out. And I just grabbed him by the back of the tanks and started swimming up. And the shark came back almost immediately and tore us back down the drop off again. And just when you don't think it could get any worse, I took that. You guys have all experienced this. That when you're running out of air, you get that first breath and
Yeah.
it doesn't fill. And now I realize I'm about to run out of air.
Right.
Very shortly after that, a matter of seconds, the sharks tore him from my grasp and dragged him away down over the drop off. He was never seen again. So here I am at an unknown depth. And so I began trying to get back to the surface, knowing I would get some air to breathe as I went up as the pressure lessened. But I think maybe I might have gotten 2 full breaths on the entire swim up. But as I was going up, I did occasionally look down at my depth gauge just to see how much further do I have to go. And not once ever did I look at the depth gauge when it wasn't pegged.
Oh.
I probably was close to 400 feet.
Wow.
And as I was going up, I stopped everything except concentrating on a wide, steady, powerful kick and hoping to make it back to the surface. And as I was looking up and heading toward the surface, I sort of ended up looking through like a hole in the, as I ran out of air, my vision began to block. And I finally ended up looking out of this hole up at the surface, and it kept getting smaller as I was becoming more and more hypoxic. And eventually I realized I was going to pass out. And I remember literally thinking to myself, damn, I almost made it, and then I passed out. But I probably was only about 30 feet from the surface, and the air that I had put in my BC at that point had expanded enough on the way up that it floated me to the surface. And when my head and shoulders broke the surface, I spontaneously exhaled because of the differential between the chest and your head. And that fueled my first breathable breath again. And so it took me probably a minute to get stabilized on the surface. Meanwhile, Robbie McElvain, the third member of our team who had gone up early, Robbie, the last thing he saw was us being attacked by the sharks and dragged over the drop off. And he thought both of us were attacked by the sharks. I had some incidental stuff, but it was mostly when they were trying to force me out of the way to bite the original victim again, which is very typical in shark attacks. But Robbie, the last he saw was us going over the drop off. So he completed his regular decompression under this barge that we were working for our surface support had we gone out there by boat. And meanwhile, I do a free ascent, but I'm out of his vision. swam to shore, could feel the onset of central nervous system type 2 bends immediately, and was just trying to get to shore before I either passed out or lost the ability to move. And I got to the beach, and I threw off my gear in the shallow water and ran up. And the first people that I saw, I said, "I'm a professional diver. I have decompression sickness. That's my truck right there." I said, "The keys are on the left front tire." I said, "On the dashboard in there is a clipboard that'll give you the instructions for medevac to get me out of here." And then I passed out. And to my everlasting, unbelievable luck, I survived because the couple that I bumped into, he was a doctor and she was a nurse, and they were familiar with uh, DCS to a certain degree, and they did exactly what I told them. They got into the truck, they got the clipboard down, they found the instructions for this stuff. They went into a local inn that was right nearby, like right across the road, and called into the lab, the Marine lab. They in turn called the medevac service, and because they had to get me off of St. Croix and take me to Puerto Rico to be treated, because there was no chamber at that time on St. Croix. And so, I ended up I ended up in the plane with a doctor that they had called. His name was Horace Norrell, and he actually was one of my diving students, and he was the emergency doc that they sent to go with me. And so off we went. And as we were on our way to Roosevelt Roads Naval Station, the pilot found out that there were two other divers in the chamber, and they couldn't accommodate me.
Oh,
And so
no.
we had to go up to the Rincon area, which is the northwest tip of Puerto Rico. It's another couple 100 miles away, and we ran out of oxygen. That I was on oxygen, and within a minute after me running out of oxygen, I stopped breathing. And so Horace, the doctor, said to the pilot, he said, "We're out of oxygen," and he says, "I'm going to ventilate him, but he says I'm not going to be able to bring him back without oxygen, and we've got to get him in the chamber." And he said, when the pilot says, "Well, what do you want me to do?" He says, "We've got to get him someplace." He says, "Can you land at San Juan Airport, and we'll drive him from there?" Well, it would have probably taken 8 hours to get to the chamber from San Juan. And the pilot said, "I got a better idea." And he called the police force the guy in San Juan, and they stopped all the traffic on the Cross Island Highway. There was 2 lanes in each direction, and the pilot landed the plane on the highway.
Wow.
And he had coordinated this with the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard landed a helicopter right next to us, and they yanked me out of the plane, put me on oxygen immediately, and I was outside, like in a MASH helicopter. I was on a stretcher outside the helicopter, and Horace was inside, and then they lifted off and flew to the hospital in Rincon, where I was treated over the course of a couple of days and then released. But see, meanwhile, the that I didn't know about, because back in that era, very, very few residents of the Virgin Islands had home phones. You had business phones, but you didn't have home phones. And the attack happened on a Saturday morning, and I was in Puerto Rico for Saturday, Sunday, and didn't get out until Monday. But when Robbie came up, he reported both of us dead.
Yeah.
And so everybody thought we were dead. And then when I came back on the Navy plane that brought me back, when I was medevaced, I was in a wetsuit, okay, and a bathing suit. And I had to borrow clothes to come back. I borrowed a pair of jeans and a polo shirt, a pair of flip-flops. Got off the plane at the airport in St. Croix, and I didn't even have any money. It never occurred to me that I was going to have to get a cab, And so I saw a cab driver I kind of knew, and I asked him if he could take me over to Frederickstead, which is where my father lived. And so I was heading over there with him, and I told him, I said, when we get to the house, I can pay you then. And he said, "That's fine, no problem." Anyway, as we were driving over towards Frederickstead, at one point when we got over on the west shore where the beach is, there's a lot of there's a lot of everything from country clubs to beach bars to things like that in that era. And as we were driving by this one place, there must have been 300 cars in the parking lot on a Monday at midday. It was really kind of odd, but I figured it was a wedding or whatever. But I also knew that the odds were really good that I was going to know somebody there that could take me the rest of the way, and I could let the cab guy go. So I just said, "Drop me off here," and I said, "I promise I'll come out to the airport tomorrow and I'll pay you." And he said, "Okay, that's cool." And I walked in to this beach restaurant bar thing, and there were close to 500 people there, and they were there for my memorial service. I walked in on my own memorial
Oh
service, and
no.
you can imagine it was pretty emotional. And so instead of being a
No.
memorial service, it turned into a pretty big party pretty quick, you know.
Yeah.
But what ended up, well, the one thing we did learn from it was what attracted the sharks initially into the close shore area was the same Navy ships that I used to work with were doing other types of exercises right out there, and they were putting low frequency sound in the water, and that's what attracted them. And the first thing that the sharks ended up seeing in the water that got their attention was us.
Right.
It was, but again, back in that era, the understanding the motivators for shark aggression just simply hadn't come yet, and so we were learning as we went. But it was the deepest free ascent
Yeah.
that anybody's ever survived. I think, if I remember correctly, I think it was Al Giddings that had an out of air situation on the Andrea Doria, uh, and I think it was the Andrea Doria, and had to do I don't know, 180 feet or something like that. I was probably more than twice that depth,
Yeah.
and managed to make it through.
Wow. Amazing. Amazing.
And 2 days and they discharged you. 2 days
2
recovery.
days when I was in the chamber.
Yeah.
Yeah. They ran a 6A table on me, and then followed it up with 2 table 6s to basically flush me out, and everything went fine.
Yeah. Amazing.
The only residuals on it for me was I lost the feeling in the ends of my fingers and toes for quite a long time. The very end, it made it difficult to use a typewriter. I used to play guitar, and I was a musical performer, and for fun. And I couldn't play the guitar anymore. I also I lost about 25% of the high and low end of my hearing, which is one of the reasons that I have to constantly remind myself I talk too loud. Okay. But the other thing was it affected my vision. And because of the decompression blockages, the bubble occlusions that were in my head somewhere. And so what ended up happening was in my right eye, I actually was legally blind in it for years. My vision was about 2650, and my vision in my left eye dropped to about 2250, which meant that I had to wear glasses, which I usually just avoided. And then I finally got turned on to contact lenses, which I liked a lot better. But in 1997, 25 years after the accident, is when they invented the surgery for your eyes, radial keratotomy and stuff like that. And it was the very beginning of LASIK surgery. And I went in and had it done, and I now have 20/20 vision, perfect vision.
Wow.
And it was amazing to survive it at all.
Right.
Was unbelievable. But then to actually be able to dispose of some of the lingering effects were amazing too. It's interesting that that attack has been written up so many times, but they actually made in the BBC in England did they did a film series in, I think it was 1990. I think it was 1992. It was 20 years after the accident, and they called it Dead Men's Tales. And what they did, I think there were 10 segments, and they were profiling basically sort of adventure explorer type people that had been faced with these impossible to survive situations. Some guy got trapped in an underground cave for 3 weeks or something like that. Some guy went out of a airplane and his parachute didn't open, and he was over the Swiss Alps and free falling to his death and fell into a snowbank after he'd only dropped about 1,500 feet, and he survived. And so they ended up, they reached out to a bunch of different things, and they wanted to include my story in it. And I said fine, and they paid me a nice little fee for it. And it was funny, as I wasn't there for any of the filming, but it was kind of an interesting situation. At one point, I was talking to the producer when I went over to, when they took me over to England, and I said, "Who who's going to play me in the movie?" You know, and they said, "Well, did you have anybody in mind?" And I said, "Well, of course, at the time I was 20 years old, and I can't remember who I picked as a. Oh, I know. The guy told me. I said, "Oh, I think it'd be perfect if you had Tom Cruise play me." And he kind of laughed and he says, "We were actually thinking more like Rowan Atkinson." You know,
Mr. Bean.
You know who Rowan Atkinson is?
Mr. Bean, yes.
He's Mr. Bean, right? Yeah. Exactly. So I just left it alone. And the funny thing is, the guy that ended up playing me in the film was Rob Palmer. Do you remember Rob Palmer?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, it was Rob Palmer, and so they made him look like a 20-year-old, and at the time he was 41. And
Wow.
so anyway, it's funny.